Nighttime on Still Waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. 9th of May, Friday. A westering sun lays long shadows across the towpath and canal. 2 geese in a field watch me from across the water. A pheasant's rasp, the scent of May. A waxing May moon is a couple of nights away from full, and all along the towpath folding clouds of hawthorn grow ghostly in the darkness. Some of the petals are already beginning to fall, dusting the canal surface with swirling constellations of petaled stars. Tonight, we float upon a starfield of blossom. This is the narrowboat Erica, narrowcasting into the gentle darkness of a soft, mild May night, to you, wherever you are. Welcome, you've made it. Thank you so much for coming. I was really hoping you'd be here. Come, let's sit and enjoy this moonlit world together. I've put the kettle on. The biscuit barrel is close at hand. Why don't you come inside? And welcome aboard. I don't know if it's the same for you, but this year, and I should perhaps caveat that by saying in Britain at least, or maybe qualify that even further by saying in this rather local part of Britain, but that spring has had a particularly luxuriant, languorous decadence about it. But then perhaps this is, after all, the very nature of our home. Bountiful, capacious and profligate in its generosity. With an economy that can only effectively work on the creation of scarcity, or the perceptions of scarcity, such wealth along the hedgerows, woodlands, meadows and scrublands can feel a bit unnerving, and then, oh, so liberating. The nightmare is just that, a nightmare, a dream dreamt up in the cold shadows of the night, and with the dawn we wake to such luxurious growth and abundance and life. John Clare, good old John Clare, he knew a thing or two about nightmares, but also about life in the real world that was lived around him. And of May he wrote, "In suns and showers luxuriant May came forth, and spread her riches as of nothing worth. Cowslips and daisies, buttercups and crowds without a name, as if they dropped from clouds on green and close and meadow everywhere. So thick the green did almost disappear to gold and silver hues, and blooms did vie with the rich grasses' luxuriant mastery." Oh, can that ever be better to describe this spring, this May? Clare's poem does move on, contrasting this open-handed opulence found in the heart of his Northamptonshire woods and fields with their destruction through human industry and ignorance. This Eden needs no snake when humans, like crouching tigers, had howled havoc here. But each year, and this year too, in suns and showers luxuriant May still comes forth, brimful of life, and with open hand and heart, and asking, perhaps this time you'll get it right. This time you will listen and understand. And I suppose it may be because of the succession of days of sunshine and clouds that we've been having this year. The syrupy, enveloping warmth, honey thick with insect hum and busy wings. True, some days have dawned with near frost, and from time to time a cold wind blows, and even a few days ago thunder rumbled in the west over Wales. But the feeling is one of the land unfurling, gracefully, lazily stretching out like a cat, velvet-pawed from its sleep. The unknotting of tense shoulder blades. Contentment that here at least, in this small corner, on this one blade of grass, life continues at its own pace, unhurried, following its own paths. And alongside the boat, the hedgerows and towpaths are lined thick with life and colour. Within just a few feet of us right now, among the florets of young cow parsley, Ladies' Anne lace and archangel, and grey globes of dandelions heavy with the feathered arrows of time waiting for the next puff of wind. Pools of bluebells lie, vetch and speedwell blues, buttercup, daisy, Herb Bennet's yellow stars, the white button stitchwort, Herb Robert pink and red campions, and although past their prime a few patches of celandine and cowslip can still be found. Pinpricks and studs of vivid colour among the flowing greens of dock and nettle, the tangled sticky ribbons of goosegrass, hogweed, plantain rosettes, burdock the size of elephants' ears, and the great gushing emerald fountains of hemlock waterdropwort. And tadpoles swim among the rushes in the tobacco-coloured waters of the sun-warmed shallows. A cyclone of gnats, tracing endless circles just above the water. A gauzy murmuration following ancient patterns beyond my understanding. Wind catches the 5 poplars and makes them sigh, as a hire boat scurries back home late evening to its wharf. The lowering sun paints the hawthorn cream. Soon the bats will be out. I had an interesting question from Shambles this week, and it was about foraging, and that's a subject I'm sort of planning in the back of my mind to do an episode on in the future. And he asked whether I did any foraging along the towpath. And I suppose the quick answer to that is yes, depending on what it is and where it is. Obviously not all spots along a towpath are particularly conducive. And I generally prefer to try to find spots off less used footpaths whenever I can. But certainly towpaths do make good foraging spots. As I say, depending on what it is and where it is. And it was also lovely to hear from Jeff Van Boeven, who's now all caught up with the episodes. Thank you. I'm really glad that you've been enjoying them. And well done, Jeff. That's quite a feat of endurance now. We're on episode 183? So 183 or 184. Anyway, that's just over 90 hours of listening. So well done. I think you deserve a medal for that. And LJ and Bodhi commented on the photograph that I used as the thumbnail for the last episode, which featured the street corner in Mimico, which had the drugstore. And she said that her dad had a corner drugstore and that it reminded of it. So, wow, that's really wonderful. You must tell me more about that, LJ. And it was also lovely to hear from Alistair and Catherine, and thank you for getting in touch. It was lovely to catch up, and I'm glad that you're enjoying the excerpts from Mum's account of their time in Canada. And I want to just send out some special warm and supportive wishes to Ellie. Thank you so much, Ellie, for your kind words. And I hope that the sun returns soon. And thank you also to Edward Giselberti, or is it Giselberti? Thank you for your comments, and I'm glad that you've been enjoying the podcast and that they helped to welcome you home late in the evenings from work. And finally, apologies to two of our lock-wheelers. I seem to be apologising a lot to our lock-wheelers recently. And this time it's to Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger. Chris got in touch with me and wanted to assure everyone who knows her that she hasn't ditched Alan and run off with an Anne, as might have been inferred from my more recent roll calls, and that she just wants to make clear that she and Alan are still very much together. I'm so sorry to both of you, and I'm really puzzled as I have Alan clearly written on my list. All I can think of is that it's my poor diction at fault. In future, I will endeavour to enunciate the L in Alan a little more clearly and hopefully avoid any confusions with any more renegade Anns. Which brings me nicely on to just say a big thank you to all of our lock-wheelers for supporting this podcast. They are Shambles, Clare Hollingsworth, Gabriela Marie Rodriguez-Veinotte, Kevin B., Fleur and David Mcloughlin, Lois Raphael, Tania Yorgey, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hinds, David Dirom, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Allison on the narrowboat Mukka, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holtzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, the narrowboat Precious Jet. Steve, your roof is coming on really well. I'm getting very jealous and envious of it. Linda Reynolds-Perkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. Over the past 3 episodes, we've been following Mum's account of the time that she and Dad emigrated to Canada. Having been encouraged by various governmental incentives, and also the news that well-paid jobs were plentiful in Canada, they decided to take the risk and emigrate there for a few years in order to build up their savings. The dream was for Dad to set up a small garage and workshop on their return. However, having landed on Canadian soil, they quickly realized that jobs were in fact scarce and that unemployment was rife. Unable to secure any type of employment, they found themselves in a situation where their savings were rapidly dwindling, with no hope of them being replenished. And furthermore, they were realizing that rather than simply being a larger version of England, Canada was, in fact, a very different country, with a culture that they were struggling to come to terms with. We joined them tonight following the rather traumatic journey to visit some friends, which entailed them walking a very long distance in the dark through a slushy Canadian countryside, something that they were subsequently told they should never do. By now, their savings were getting very low, and difficult decisions lay ahead of them. Canada, there and back and why. A totally worthwhile risk that was never regretted, taken by Mick and Erica, as seen through the eyes of Erica. Part 4. 10. Mick continued to report daily to the Employment Exchange, but the situation didn't improve, and didn't seem likely to in the foreseeable future. And we had felt it was no use my getting a job, as the chances of Mick getting one in the near future seemed so highly unlikely. And no way could he inveigle an employer into taking him on for any employment that he was not, in his eyes, competent for. Although he was still prepared to accept a more menial job should one occur, with the idea that when the economic situation improved and full production was once more in full swing, he could then be transferred to one that was more in his line. So we occupied ourselves as well as we could, spending as little as possible of our precious savings, except for bare necessities. One morning, we awoke to dense fog, in spite of the air temperature outside being that of a hot British summer's day, thus making it feel very humid and energy-sapping. But on the whole, the weather was now very pleasant, and we enjoyed looking around and taking everything in. We went to have a look at Lake Ontario, which to us could easily have been the seaside. There was no sign of land, the open water stretching far into the distance, and there were quite prominent waves. It was so huge. On the Good Friday, it was too nice to stay indoors, so we decided to have a good long walk, and decided to walk to the next suburb. After some time, we arrived at what was obviously the next small township, which in appearance was very similar to Mimico. And as we wandered along the main street, gazing about us, we were staggered to come across Jack Kettlewell. He was working on a house close by and doing some painting. I don't know who was the more surprised, he or us. But what puzzled him was how we had managed to get there, as there was no public transport that day due to it being a bank holiday. He was suitably appalled when we said quite casually that we had walked there. And when he had got over the shock, he advised us, quite seriously, to tell no one else about our walk, as the locals would look upon us as being completely mad. No one in Canada walked any distances just for the fun of it. But by now we were beginning to get really concerned about the state of our finances. We felt that if our fortunes didn't change fairly quickly, we would have to think about giving up and going back home. We of course talked this over with the Kettlewells, who were very unhappy at the idea of us returning home. The Canadians, quite rightly, are justly proud of their country, and they took it very personally that their country had let us down, or that we might feel that it had let us down. But they were a little happier when we told them that, in the event of our returning to England, we would certainly come back again when the economic situation was healthier. And this we firmly intended to do at the time. Meanwhile, Marie and Jack did all in their power to make our time there as happy as possible. We often ate at their house, and they took us out in their car, proudly showing off all their achievements, usually with the comment that it was so bigger and so much better than those we had back in dear old England. For as far as they could see, we were years behind them in many, many ways, and to a certain extent, that was true. One evening, we went with the Kettlewells to visit some friends of theirs, a very jolly outward-going couple, who plied us with drinks as soon as we got there. And of course our English accent fascinated them, and it wasn't long before a tape recorder was produced, and we were exhorted to speak into the microphone, which immediately caused Mick and I to shut up like clams. I can't remember the outcome, but I expect we must have complied, even if rather stiltedly. And during the evening, while we were drinking and chatting, our host asked me if I would like my drink spiked. Not knowing what that meant, I agreed, and we presume he must have put a dash of rye whiskey in it or something. After a very pleasant evening, we finally arrived back home, and thankfully fell into bed, only to be awakened in the middle of the night by my having the most terrible stomach pains that I've ever had. All the next day I lay in bed in terrible agony, and we daren't call a doctor for fear of the cost. Fortunately, as the day wore on, so I gradually improved, and by the following day I felt strong enough to call in at the local chemist shop, where we had a word with the pharmacist, who gave me something to settle it, which it did. But I still felt very washed out for several days afterwards. We concluded that the cause of the trouble was whatever the dear soul had spiked my drink with. Our continued visits to the employment exchange were as fruitless as ever, and our savings were diminishing at a fast rate. Remembering that just the living expenses were twice what they were in England, so our money was only worth half its value. So, with a sinking heart, we decided that the most sensible thing to do was to go home, while we could still afford the fare, and with luck still have enough left over to buy a very small second-hand caravan to live in on our return. At least we would have somewhere to call our own. And so we went along to the local travel agents, where we managed to book up on the Cunard liner Ivernia. We then went along to the carriers, who, not many weeks before, had looked after our crates when we first arrived in the country. Now we were asking them to come and pick them up again for our departure. The owner of the firm of carriers, a friendly old boy, was as sad as everyone else at our need to give up. But we repeated that we would return one day. He loved everything connected with Britain, including, he said, the lovely fresh pink complexion of the girls, so different from the pallid ones of most of the Canadian women. I was most impressed when he complimented me on my rosy complexion, especially as I was still feeling very wan and far from rosy after my recent tummy upset. And now we would have to start packing up once again. 11. Soon our packing cases were ready for the carriers who came and picked them up, and everything else that was not for immediate use was packed into our hand luggage. Now all that was left for us to do was to say goodbye to all those kind people who had made our short stay so happy. And all too soon the day of departure arrived, and this time we would be embarking on the RMS Ivernia, Cunard line in Montreal, the St. Lawrence River now fully opened up after the winter freeze. The start of our journey was by train, leaving Toronto main station at around midnight and arriving at Montreal early dawn. The Kettlewells insisted that we should spend the last evening with them, first giving us a wonderful farewell meal, and then, before taking us to catch our train, they wanted to show us yet one more recent achievement that they knew would vastly impress us. So, once we had eaten, we all climbed into Jack's car and sped off into the night. We travelled several miles in total darkness, until suddenly we found that we were looking down on what appeared to be a vast fairground. As Jack drove down toward the lights, we realized that we were entering a huge car park that surrounded a very large shopping complex, the Dixie Plaza. They were quite right. We had never seen anything like it before, and they had every right to be so proud of it. We had a quick wander around some of the fantastic shops, but all too soon it was time for us to catch our train. But we knew that we would never forget that wonderful sight of that great expanse of bright glittering lights suddenly appearing out of the total darkness, out in the middle of nowhere. We finally arrived back at Toronto Station and sadly said goodbye to our good friends Marie and Jack and their little son, boarded the train, and settled down to try and get some sleep. Otherwise, it was going to be a long night. In actual fact, we both dozed off intermittently, and were both rewarded in watching the dawn creeping up over the barren Canadian scrub that seemed to constitute their countryside. One of the things we missed most was the lack of green. All the vegetation was a blend of various shades of brown, with very few trees. But with the dawn came the awareness that soon we would arrive at Montreal, and once more be sea-bound. I hoped the fierce storms that we had encountered coming over were now things of the past. I wasn't too keen on experiencing those again. Once more, we found ourselves going through all the embarking procedures and joining up with our fellow passengers who were boarding the Ivernia. The Ivernia was twice the size of the liner on which we had travelled over, being 22,000 tons, so I hoped a lot more stable. But that was really the only good thing about it. When we were eventually shown our cabin, we found it to be an inside one. No porthole to gaze out of this time. Instead, one rather felt as if one was sleeping in the broom cupboard. And the stewards all wore uniforms of blue serge, giving the appearance of prison warders. The dining room stewards did wear short white jackets, but many of them were scruffy-looking with frayed collars and cuffs, giving a very unkempt appearance, which obviously affected the wearers themselves, as they were equally slovenly in their attitude toward the passengers. It was quite an eye-opener to the smart appearance of both officers and crew that we had been used to on the Seven Seas. And we felt very ashamed, especially when one realised that the majority of the passengers were Canadians going to Britain for a holiday, maybe for the first time. Not a very good advertisement for Britain, we felt. The seas were a lot calmer now, but it was not long before we were engulfed by thick fog, and as we were in the vicinity of icebergs, the captain felt that it would be prudent to sail only through the hours of daylight, and the mournful moaning of the foghorn could be heard continually. Now, once again, the journey took a couple of days longer than expected, but, as on our trip out, the end-of-voyage dinner was still held on the day originally planned, although we were still at least a couple of days sailing in front of us. Gradually the journey came to an end. We arrived in Southampton early morning, first calling into Le Havre, which we found a little disappointing. Knowing that that was going to be the first port of call, we got up early to have a look at this bustling French port, but all that was visible was a lone fisherman sitting hunched on his stool in the early morning mist. And soon after leaving France, we passed the Isle of Wight as we approached Southampton. And it was not only the Canadians who exclaimed with pleasure the sight of the brilliant greens of the British countryside. We'd only been away a very short time ourselves, but how we missed that wonderful sight, which we always took so much for granted. 12. At last we were back on British soil again. As we fully intended returning to Canada when the economic climate improved, we didn't regard our recent venture as a total failure, and there was some feeling of relief in that before too long our bank balance would once more be in a more healthy state, as Mick and I would soon return to work. As at that time our finances were very depleted, we had just about enough money to buy a second-hand caravan, and Mick decided that, to start with, we should stay with his parents in Herne Bay, which being a holiday area with many caravan sites, there should be a good supply of second-hand caravans for sale. But before that, the first thing to do was to book in at a B&B, which was soon accomplished. Then we bought a paper to look through the ads once more, this time for a car. Mick found a Willys Jeep for sale, which was well within our means, and on ringing up the advertiser, it was arranged that we would go and see it the following morning. The next day, after starting off with an enormous breakfast, which even I found almost too much, we set off to keep our appointment, which was in Totton, a suburb of Southampton. I can't quite remember, but presumably we went by bus, eventually arriving at the given address, which was obviously a gypsy traveller site, and there was the jeep completely plastered with mud, the owner apparently using it for hauling logs. Mick looked over the jeep, and apart from it needing a good clean, there didn't seem to be too much wrong with it, and so on our agreeing to buy it, the chap took us over into his very ornate caravan to complete the formalities. We handed over the cash, £35, and he gave us all the relevant documents, also the book of petrol coupons, petrol still being on ration due to the Suez crisis. Later, Mick found that he had taken out some of the later coupons, but fortunately for us, petrol rationing was over by then. As we drove off, he told us to drop into a certain garage where there would be a new battery waiting for us. This we rather sceptically did, and were amazed that he was as good as his word, and when the new battery was safely installed, we set off for the docks to pick up our 2 crates. And with that done, we were now ready to start off on our marathon journey all along the south coast, from Southampton to Herne Bay in Kent. But taking on a journey of that magnitude in an untried vehicle held no terrors for us. And the jeep behaved magnificently, except for one little hiccup. I believe dirt in the carburettor. Anyway, it was a very simple job which Mick normally would have put right in a matter of minutes. But all his spanners, etc., were down in the depths of one of the crates, so it meant getting help from a friendly garage, who in no time at all had us back on the road again. And we eventually arrived at Herne Bay around tea time, to be welcomed by an amazed chick and the old boy, that's Dad's parents, who had no idea that we would turn up in quite such an unconventional vehicle. And the next part of the saga is in the next book. The book to which Mum refers, she entitled Our Caravan Homes, The Simple Life. But that we'll save for the future. For now, this is the narrowboat Erica, signing off for the night and wishing you a very peaceful and restful night. Good night. Temperature outside 11 degrees, inside 18 degrees, humidity 47%, dew point 3 degrees, wind direction east, wind strength 9 miles per hour, barometric pressure 1015.2, rising, cloud cover 0%, cloud ceiling none, precipitation nil, moon phase 97.1%, waxing gibbous, day length 15 hours 28 minutes, sunset 20:48, sky casting 5:18.